Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Simon Marks. Let's start with the day's top headlines. Ukraine takes delivery of more US military aid after President Joe Biden says the West is united in warning Russia of grave consequences if it invades its pro-Western neighbor. Russia says it's watching with great concern after the United States puts 8,500 troops on alert to be ready to deploy to Europe in case of an escalation in the Ukraine crisis. Russia's troops hold exercises in the country's North Murmansk region. Soldiers train against a hypothetical enemy and repel surprise attacks. The Metropolitan Police Chief says officers are now investigating several parties that took place at Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Downing Street office and other government departments during COVID-19 lockdowns. Uzbekistan suspends electricity exports to Afghanistan amid a large-scale power disruption in the country. Heavy snow blankets much of Athens, disrupting city life. The snowfall led to Parliament being suspended and schools shutting down across the Greek capital. Fears of a Russian invasion in Ukraine are growing by the day, and there are enormous questions now about whether diplomatic options can secure a de-escalation in tensions. Russian troops have encircled Ukraine from three sides, and Western leaders insist they are united in the face of potential Russian aggression.
I had a very good meeting, total unanimity with all the European leaders. We'll talk about it later. Thank you.
The Western military alliance has begun moving its troops towards Ukraine. They're also sending additional ships, fighter jets, and more military equipment into Eastern Europe. Denmark is sending 4 F-16 fighter jets and a frigate to join NATO operations in the Baltic region and Northern Europe. The frigate, the Peter Willemoes, will strengthen one of NATO's standing naval forces, which usually operate in the Baltic Sea as well as the North and Eastern Atlantic. More NATO member countries will be putting their forces on standby and sending military resources to Eastern Europe to reassure partners and allies in the region.
We are considering to further enhance our presence in the eastern part of the alliance. This could include the deployment of additional NATO battle groups. These deployments are proportionate and in line with our international commitments, and they reinforce European security for all of us. At the same time, NATO remains ready to continue dialogue with Russia.
US airmen have been seen loading military weaponry and supplies to aid Ukraine. The Biden administration has put 8,500 troops on heightened alert for potential deployment to Europe in the event that NATO's response force is soon activated by the alliance in response to the deepening crisis.
Secretary Austin has placed a range of units in the United States on a heightened preparedness to deploy, which increases our readiness to provide forces if NATO should activate the NRF, or if other situations developed. All told, the number of forces that the Secretary has placed on heightened alert comes up to about 8,500 personnel.
France has offered to send troops to Romania under NATO command. The Netherlands is sending 2 F-35 fighter jets to Bulgaria to help with air policing, and Spain is sending a frigate to the Black Sea. NATO members bordering Russia and Belarus have asked for more allied troops and equipment, and all these additional forces will help build up deterrence against any potential Russian aggression. Around 5,000 NATO troops are already stationed in Poland and the 3 Baltic countries. NATO calls it an enhanced forward presence, and the European Union has readied its defences against a possible Russian cyber attack against Ukraine.
Our swift condemnation of the cyber attack and our readiness to assist Ukraine 10 days ago, when we were at Brest, also was a clear proof of our readiness, our capacity and will to act. We will be ready to respond to further attacks of this type, and we will continue to build up resilience on countering foreign information manipulation. We are ready to mobilize a mission to support Ukraine on fighting against cyber attacks.
WION's correspondent Rosie Burchard has sent us more on the European response from Brussels.
Here in Brussels, European leaders are trying to portray a very united approach to this crisis based on 3 main goals: to try and pursue a diplomatic solution, to provide support to Ukraine, but also to stand ready to impose massive sanctions should any invasion occur. And alongside NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg, several EU allies took part in this transatlantic teleconference late last night with US President Joe Biden. They emerged from that again with a line of true unity, and once again reissuing that threat to Russia that sanctions would be on the table and would be imposed should any incursion occur. Now, however, EU leaders are in some ways behind closed doors, we believe, struggling to find a truly united approach on certain areas of this. So we know, for example, that when it comes to the transfer of weapons and lethal weapons in particular, Germany has exposed itself as an outlier there. So Europe is definitely trying to pursue a united approach, particularly this transatlantic unity to be portrayed. However, we know that there may be some divisions behind closed doors, which, should there be an invasion, that could slightly weaken Europe's hand here.
Now, the mobilisation by the West comes in response to Russia's actions, with Western leaders saying the build-up of Russian forces along Ukraine's border is larger than anything seen since the end of the Cold War. Ukraine says there are at least 127,000 Russian troops at its borders, and thousands more are expected to arrive in Belarus soon. They're armed with tanks, artillery and fighter jets. In another video released by the Russian Defense Ministry, the Northern Fleet could be seen holding exercises. One group of Ukrainian military experts has estimated that Russia is at least 2 to 3 weeks away from completing its deployment of forces to Ukraine. While Western and Russian diplomats have had multiple meetings in various locations over the last several weeks, the country they were discussing was largely left out of most of those talks. Ukrainians are now taking their security into their own hands. Reports suggest that Kyiv has been preparing a territorial defence force. That force mostly consists of volunteers training to defend the Ukrainian capital and Ukrainian territory from any attack. Those on the front line fear that diplomatic discussions will achieve nothing.
Я не думаю, что они затеяли эти переговоры для того, чтобы договориться. То есть Европа, как бы у них там, понятно, что они там боятся, у них там свои страхи, у них там свои дела, желания. А России эти переговоры неинтересны. У них есть свои задачи, которые им надо выполнять, которые поставили эти планы.
In the event of an invasion, Ukraine's military would be vastly outnumbered. Here are some numbers comparing the military strength of the two countries. While Ukraine's forces are stronger than they were 7 years ago, the West is in no doubt that they would be quickly overwhelmed, which is why they are scrambling to send in reinforcements. The decision to fast-track arms to Ukraine signals a consensus that Russia could attack soon, at any time, the White House says. But Russia has denied it is planning an invasion. Instead, the Kremlin accused Washington of fueling tensions over Ukraine. Russia reiterated that the crisis is being driven by US and NATO actions rather than by its own buildup of troops at the Ukrainian border. Amid all the mounting fears of an armed conflict, diplomatic avenues for de-escalation remain open, and France has initiated a fresh attempt to defuse the simmering tension. Diplomatic advisers from Russia, Ukraine, France and Germany, the so-called Normandy Four, will meet for talks in Paris tomorrow. French President Emmanuel Macron will host the talks. He has expressed deep concern about the situation at Russia's border with Ukraine and is pushing for a collective need for rapid de-escalation. Macron will also meet Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky tomorrow. A statement from the Élysée Palace said that President Macron remains determined to use all resources of diplomacy to preserve the stability of Europe and to show solidarity and readiness to support EU members. The Paris dialogue aims to push Moscow fully to implement the 2015 Minsk peace accords by withdrawing support for rebel groups fighting the Ukrainian government in the eastern Donbas region of Ukraine. Meanwhile, here in Washington, US President Joe Biden was caught on a hot mic cursing a Fox News reporter at a White House event as journalists were ushered out of a meeting of the president's Economic Competition Council. A White House correspondent from Fox News shouted a question about inflation. The president responded sarcastically over the din of reporters without realizing that his microphone was still switched on.
Mr. President, could you give us a brief update on your call with European leaders on what's happening in Ukraine today?
The only reason I don't like doing this is you never report on why I've called a meeting. And this is really important. I had a very, very, very good meeting, total unanimity with all the European leaders. We'll talk about it later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Why are you sending anyone on the Ukraine card? What do you think, President? Do you think it places a political liability?
Thank you all.
Do you think it places a political liability?
That's a great asset. More inflation. What a stupid son of a bitch.
And the president later called the reporter to apologise. Yemen's Houthi rebels have launched another missile attack on the United Arab Emirates. It took place on Monday. According to the US and Emirati officials, a base hosting the US military came under attack, but the attack was thwarted by US-built Patriot interceptors. This was the second attack on the UAE in a week. 8 days ago, Houthis attacked a fuel depot in Abu Dhabi. 2 Indians and 1 Pakistani were killed in that attack. A Houthi military spokesman said the group had fired Zulfikar ballistic missiles at the Al Dhafra air base and other sensitive targets. He said that drones were also launched towards Dubai. The Foreign Ministry of the UAE called the attack a criminal escalation and says it has a right to respond. The US military says it fired multiple Patriot interceptors at 2 inbound missiles. The Emirati ambassador to the United States tweeted that close cooperation with Washington had helped deflect the attack. The US State Department reaffirmed Washington's commitment to strengthening the defense of its Saudi and Emirati partners.
These attacks on the UAE and Saudi Arabia, as well as recent airstrikes in Yemen that killed civilians, represent a troubling escalation that only exacerbates the suffering of the Yemeni people. We call on all parties to the conflict to commit to a ceasefire, abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law, including those related to protection of all civilians, and participate fully in an inclusive, UN-led peace process.
The Houthis have repeatedly carried out cross-border missile and drone attacks on Saudi Arabia, but by targeting the UAE, they have raised the stakes in a conflict largely seen as a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The US Embassy issued a rare security advisory for the UAE, urging American nationals to maintain a high level of security awareness. The Saudi-led coalition says that airstrikes in Yemen were aimed at crippling Houthi capabilities. At least 60 people lost their lives in Sadr province on Friday. Kurdish-led forces have said that they raided part of a prison seized by IS fighters in northeast Syria. At least 300 terrorists surrendered on Monday. The Syrian Democratic Forces said terrorists were still holed up in other buildings. Plans are underway to clear the rest of the detention complex in Hasaka city. At least 180 inmates and 27 security force officials have died since the IS terrorists attacked the jail on Thursday in a bid to free their members. On Thursday, 2 explosive-packed vehicles rammed into the Kurdish-run prison, a jailbreak operation that plunged the city of Hasaka into chaos. The United Nations Children Agency, UNICEF, has called for the evacuation of nearly 850 children who are held in the complex with their families. Around 10% of children who are trapped are believed to be 15 years old or younger. UNICEF says children were at immediate risk. Human Rights Watch heard voice messages from an injured minor at the prison who reported that there are bodies everywhere. The jail is the largest among several publicly known prisons where the Syrian forces hold suspected terrorists and other detainees. The aid groups say the prison is overcrowded and inhumane conditions are prevalent. According to Human Rights Watch, Syrian forces hold a total of about 12,000 men and boys who are suspected to be affiliated with Islamic State. Up to 45,000 people have fled their homes in Hasaka city. And now a change of pace. Cultivating truffles calls for an unarguably unique sense of taste, and finding them is also a very complex task. Truffle hunting has now made it to UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage. There's one.
Have you ever wondered why Italian truffles are so expensive? Truffles, which are just knobbly pieces of fungus, are in fact a delicacy, adored for their ability to impart a unique note to dishes. To cultivate them is a task and a half. And to procure them, well, that is a different ballgame altogether. One that requires special training of dogs and their humans. A complex task. That has now made it to the UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity. Truffles cannot be farmed. They grow only in clean-kept woods and gardens, and on very specific trees such as oak, willow and lime. The trees are carefully cleaned of ivy and other weeds, after which it can take decades for the tree to yield truffles. And these furry hunters here have been trained to sniff out truffles when that happens.
Today, the dog takes a truffle out here. Tomorrow, in another spot. He slowly creates a sort of Google Maps for himself. He memorizes the spots and then knows where to look for them the following time. It also depends on the truffle season, if there are a lot or not. There are many factors to take into consideration.
However, the number of truffles has been decreasing in recent years. The UNESCO recognition came after multiple calls for safeguarding the practice.
A truffle hunter is somebody that is and will always be individualistic. He has his secret spots and will not share them with anyone. He will go alone on his set journey. But we are understanding more and more that some big issues that are linked to the weather, the climate, the safeguard of the plants and truffle trees, their upkeep, are all things that need collective actions.
Truffle hunters have joined hands to try and create more spaces for truffles to grow. Like the Roche del Roero Truffle Hunters Association, which has planted 550 poplars across 10 towns in the Roero region. And every year, the 60-something members of the association come together to clean the woods in order to protect the truffles already growing on them. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
And that's all for this edition of WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Simon Marks. I'll be back at the same time tomorrow, same time, same place. See you then and stay with WION. World is One.
There are many other... this is right, Arab.